Yahudiler Allah'ın eli bağlıdır dediler mi? Tanrı'nın eli bağlı tam olarak ne anlama geliyor? Bu bir insan biçimcilik mi?
Did the Jews say God's hand is tied up? And what does God's hand is tied up exactly mean? Is this an anthropomorphism?
All right, so I guess I'll begin with your initial question, which is that, as we know, in one of the more sarcastic of the Quran's taunts against the Jews, the Quran claims that the Jews claim that God is miserly and not generous. As we see in chapter 5, verse 64, the Jews say the hand of God is chained. The Arabic word there is maghlula. And then it responds to the Jews saying, may their hands be chained and may they be cursed for what they say. Rather, both of his hands are outstretched and he gives as he pleases. Now, the Quran itself doesn't appear to understand this verse as a literal anthropomorphism in which the Jews are saying that God's hands are literally chained. And we can see that from the context of that phrase, that God's hands are maghlula, because the response is God gives as he pleases. And that giving is understood to be financial generosity. So the Jews are saying God's hands are chained, and the Quran says, no, his hands are not chained. He is financially generous to his people. So the Quran doesn't seem to understand the Jews' claim as one of literally God's hands being chained, but of financial pulling back, sort of causing people to not have as much money as they need. And this is what we find in almost all of the early classical exegetical texts, that it's an accusation of miserliness and not an accusation of actual physical, God having physical hands. Now, most Jews, having read this text, would say, nowhere do Jews say this. Jews don't claim, no Jewish texts actually claim that God has withdrawn his financial support of people. And in fact, if you look at the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, we find it to be the exact opposite, that we find that in Psalms 145:16, for example, it says about God, the Bible says about God, you, meaning God, you open your hand and satisfy every living thing, right? So God is open-handed with his generosity. And God says in the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 2, he says, I constantly open my hands, spread out my hands to a disloyal people who walk in the way that is not good, following their own design. So God supports both people who follow him and people who are disloyal. He doesn't withdraw that help. Now, while the Bible doesn't talk about God withdrawing, sort of closing his hand, in terms of financial restraint, I guess one could say, the Bible does talk about God's hands being restrained, or more properly speaking, God restraining his own hands. And we find scholars often point to two verses in particular. One in Lamentations, the book of Eicha, chapter 2, where God says, desires to punish the nation of Israel because they are sinning. And then Lamentations chapter 2, verse 3 says that in blazing anger, God cuts down all of the might of Israel. And then it says he has withdrawn his right hand in the presence of the foe, meaning he takes his hand back. Well, that's my left hand. He takes his right hand back. And meaning that he doesn't protect them. He pulls back his protection so that the enemy can destroy or attack the Israelites. We find another similar depiction of God taking his hand away to allow something bad to happen. We find this in a pseudepigraphal text. People will know the word pseudepigraphal. So the pseudepigrapha are parts of the Bible that are not part of the Hebrew Bible. So they are not part of the Jewish Bible, and they're considered, the rabbis didn't include them in the Bible. They get preserved by the Christian tradition largely, which is good for us as historians because the material is there, but they're not part of the rabbinic and the Jewish tradition today, right? It doesn't get into the Bible. So there's a 5th century pseudepigraphal text called 3 Enoch, which has been suggested as a source for this Quranic verse. And the story that goes in this verse is that there's a rabbi named Rabbi Ishmael who tells the story that an angel whose name is Metatron approaches him and offers to bring him before God. And Metatron, the angel, says that God is sitting despondent and dejected. And he says of God in particular, he says to Rabbi Ishmael, "Come, I will show you the right hand of Makom," meaning the place, which is a way to refer to God, the right hand of God laid behind him because of the destruction of the temple. And Rabbi Ishmael goes with Metatron to heaven and finds God sitting with his right hand thrown behind him, just as he had described. So this verse is often put forth as possibly the source of the Quranic verse, that the Quranic verse is referring to this, that God is sitting with his right hand behind him. Other scholars have put forth other possible sources for this Quranic verse. One other source that was recently suggested is from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Menachot, page 29b, where it's a very lovely story in which Moses, when he goes up to the Mount Sinai to get the Bible, to get the 10 Commandments, he finds God sitting and drawing little crowns on all the tops of the words. And he says, "Master of the universe, who is staying your hand?" Meaning preventing you from finishing writing this text. Now, it's a whole longer story, which we don't need to get into, but that phrase, "who stays your hand," meaning who is preventing you from finishing writing, has been suggested as a possible source, again, for the Quran saying God's hands are chained. But I think none of these three are actual sources. I don't think the Quran is talking about any of these three sources. I think people suggest them as possibilities, and I think they're all bad possibilities. Try to be nice to other scholars, but I think they're bad possibilities. Number one, what the Quran says is that God's hand is chained. And these three sources, don't mention a chain. These three sources both talk about God with his hand just held behind him, that it's just behind him. Number two, it sounds in the Jewish sources that God is doing it to himself, right? He's simply removing his hand the way that you would do that, right? If somebody wants to give you something and you don't want it, you put your hands behind yourself, and it sounds like that's what God's doing. Whereas in the Quran, it sounds like the Jews in the Quran are saying that someone came in and chained God's hands, right? That someone beat God and put his hand in chains. And number three is the ramifications of this, right? That, again, as I had said at the beginning, for the Quran, this is a story of financial restraint. And in the Jewish text, it's a staying of physical power. It has nothing to do with money in the Jewish texts. It's all about God's actual power. This is not to say that the Bible doesn't talk about God's hands when it comes to talking about finances. That imagery of God's hands, something wrong with God's hands, does appear in the Bible when it comes to finances, but it's never about God's hands being chained. The image in the Bible is always that God's hands are made shorter. So when God is being generous, his hand is long. And when God is being not generous, when he takes away support, his hands are shorter, but never chained. So if the Quran is saying that the Jews are saying chained, it doesn't sound like it's pointing to this biblical imagery. There's something else that's going on here. The other thing that's important is that in the Jewish tradition, it's these verses that I had mentioned all talk about God's right hand, right? That his right hand is thrown behind him. And God's right hand is not associated with money. God's right hand is associated with power, right? So the physical power, sometimes with righteousness, sometimes with justice, that God has the right hand of justice, God has the right hand of righteousness, but never is it God's right hand of bounty, right? That his right hand is specific for a different image. So I don't think any of those previously suggested ways of finding the source for this, what is the Quran talking about, the Jews are talking about, right? Is the Quran pointing to something that the Jews actually said? It sounds like maybe no, that the Quran is not, the Quran is the Quran making something up that didn't actually happen? And I think the answer is no, the Quran is not making up something that actually happened, but we have to look to a source that people have not normally looked to. And that is a body of literature called piyutim. So what are piyutim? Piyutim is the plural, the singular is piyut. Piyutim are liturgical poems, which means poems that are used in prayer services. So Jewish prayer services are very long. There's a lot of things that are recited in them. And in the pre-Islamic period, there were a lot of these poems that were composed and were intended to be read alongside other prayers. Now, the rabbis didn't love the piyutim because they often included midrashic interpretations that the rabbis didn't think transmitted the right messages, or they said things that were deemed to be somewhat scandalous, these poems. And so the rabbis tried to prevent these piyutim from entering into prayer services. The problem with that was that the Jews themselves really liked them. And so they just kept saying them. And after a while, what was non-canonical became canonical, and they're still recited today. They're part of the official prayer services of Jewish prayer services. So that's an explanation of piyutim. There's one piyut in particular that is relevant for this discussion, and that is a poem, a liturgical poem, written by a paitan, meaning a liturgical poet, whose name is Hakalir. He's known as Hakalir, Rabbi Elazar Hakalir, who lived, we're not really sure when he lived. There's not a lot of biographical information on him, but he is said to have lived somewhere in the pre-Islamic era. So this 6th century before the rise of Islam in the land of Israel. And he writes a piyut that is meant to be recited on a very specific day, which is the day called Tisha B'Av in Hebrew, or the 9th of the month of Av. So the 9th of the month of Av is a day of mourning in the Jewish tradition. And it's a day that is supposed to commemorate, or that commemorates, the destruction of the first and second temples. So the first temple of the Jews is destroyed in 586 before the Common Era by the Babylonians. It's rebuilt and then destroyed again in 70 CE by the Romans. And this day of mourning, which is a fast day, commemorates the destruction of both of those temples, and also the loss of national autonomy. With the destruction in the year 70, the Romans exile the Jews from the land of Israel. So we have the destruction of the political autonomy of the Jews in the land of Israel, and this continued exile that the Jews are still in, right? That the Jews are still living outside of the land of Israel without the temple being rebuilt. So there's a lot of tragedies that are lumped onto this day. Once you're already mourning for these two things, the tradition tends to lump a lot of other tragedies on. But the important thing for our conversation is that it's the destruction of these two temples. And Hakalir writes a liturgical poem that is known by its first name. Then these poems don't have titles, so they're just referred to by the first line of the poem, which is remember what the enemy did inside. That's the name of the poem. And it's recited on the 9th of Av. So the poem is based on chapter 5 of the book of Lamentations in the Bible. Chapter 5 of the Book of Lamentations of the Bible, like all of Lamentations, is about the destruction of the first temple. But the poem that Kalir writes is about the destruction of the second temple, basing himself on this Book of Lamentations about the first, right? Because we have these melding together of the tragedies, and every line in the poem starts with a word from chapter 5, or emphasizes a word from chapter 5 of the Book of Lamentations. Okay, so what is this poem about? Basically, it's a poem of complaint in which the poet is complaining against God that he allows the temple to be destroyed, right? If the Jews are God's people, in the Jewish understanding, then why does God allow the enemy to come in and destroy the temple? And in fact, the poem starts with an even more interesting story. Story is not the right word, maybe. It starts with reference to a midrashic text from the so I'm blanking on when it's from. I think the 5th century, which is it's a midrashic text on the Book of Lamentations, chapter 40, verse 1. And the story there is told. Sorry, can we go back? I think I made a mistake there. It's not from there. It's from elsewhere. The account appears not in Lamentations Rabbah, but in a text called Leviticus Rabbah, which dates from the 5th to 6th century, so 400 to 500, and it also appears in the Talmud. And the account, it's an account of Titus's destruction of Jerusalem. So Titus, the Roman general, who comes in and destroys Jerusalem. So according to the story, when Titus comes into the temple, he comes into the holiest of places in the temple, the sort of the back room, that's the Holy of Holies, and he takes out his sword and he stabs the curtain and he ransacks the place and he spreads filth all over the place and he steals the temple vessels, the holy vessels. And in one particular version of it, he takes a prostitute inside and he has intercourse with a prostitute in the holiest place to the Jews, right? So in God's house. And the Piyut replies that people are seeing this, right? The Jews are seeing this happen. And the women and the nobles become so frightened that they can't even react. They're just sort of stunned into powerlessness. And the young warriors bravely gather together to fight against Titus. But as they get there, they see that God had sent 6,000 angels to fight what they think is to fight off Titus. And nothing happens. The angels are standing there, but they don't do anything. And then the Piyut says, not only did the angels not do anything, but God himself was bound in chains. And in Hebrew, we have the term V'hu asur ba'azikim, that God is bound in chains. Now, this is fascinating because the Quran says that the Jews say that God's hands are chained. And now we find this liturgical poem from before the Quranic era, from before Muhammad, in which the Jews are actually saying that God's hands are bound in chains. So it seems that the Quran is pointing to something that the Jews, in fact, did say. But we do have to answer a different question, which is the Jews are not talking about financial, right? They're not talking about financially being bound. They're talking about God restraining himself, or God not fighting for the Jews and allowing Titus to destroy the temple and to destroy everything. So did the Quran misunderstand what the Jews are saying? What actually is going on? I could go talk about this for hours because there's a lot of texts that we could talk about, but it's not a Quranic misunderstanding. Well, what we need to understand in order to understand what the Quran is doing, is to understand what the piyut is doing, which is that there is a long midrashic tradition in which God is said to go into exile with the Jews when the Jews are exiled. I'll say it a different way. The destruction of the temples of both of them, but in particular the second temple, which is so horrific, was so horrific to the Jews that the natural inclination is to think, if God let this happen to us, maybe he no longer loves us. And in fact, that's what Christianity says about the Jews, right? God doesn't love you anymore, and we have a new bond, and we have replaced you in God's affection. And the rabbis are trying to explain to the Jewish people that that is not true, actually, that just because God allows the temple to be destroyed doesn't mean that God doesn't maintain his covenant with you and doesn't still love you and feel bonded to you. And so the rabbis start to teach that God not only still loves the Jewish people, but empathizes with them. And there are rabbinic texts that talk about God weeping over the destruction of the temple and mourning over the destruction of the temple, and that he's so grieving that God, has to hire professional mourners to mourn with him and for the destruction of the temple. And some of this we can see actually in the Hebrew Bible itself, where it talks about God being with the Jews at all times. And so the rabbis create a number of texts that say to the Jews, I know it sounds like God has rejected you, but that's not what's going on. God is in exile with you, and just as you are in chains, God also is in chains. And probably the key midrashic text about that is a text that is related to something that is said, or supposedly said by Jeremiah. Basically, there is a prophet who is taken into exile. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 39, verse 40, Jeremiah states that he is being taken into exile. And he says, the text tells us that Jeremiah is taken into exile while his hands are chained. And we find that the Midrash actually uses that verse to teach us something very, very, very surprising. And it says, not only is Jeremiah chained, but also God is chained as well. So we have that the Midrash tries to tell us that not only does God suffer with us, but he suffers exactly in the same way. That just as we are enchained, so too God is enchained. And Jeremiah says it's his hands that are chained, and so too therefore God's hands are chained. But again, we have to ask, why then does the Quran turn this idea of God being in chains into a question of financial dependence? And it's a very strange thing, because in the Islamic exegesis, the exegesis spends very little energy on this verse, on chapter 5, verse 64. The most that we find is that it's linked with the Quran, chapter 3, verse 181. And in chapter 3, verse 181, the claim is that the Jews, who are understood to be the Jews, say, God is poor and we are rich. And Islamic exegesis says the person who said that is this Jewish man named Finhas, who also said chapter 5, verse 64. And that's it. That's all it states. So it doesn't really give context for 5, verse 64. But we can see the financial link there, right? He says, God is poor, we are rich. And he also says, God hands are chained. So we see how the financial thing is happening. What I think is going on here is actually not just that, and it's not a Quranic misunderstanding. I think it's the Quran using the Jews' words against them. If you look at the context of chapter 5, verse 64, if you back up to a few verses, you see that the Quran is talking about the Jews saying inappropriate things about God. So let's pull it up there for a second. Okay, so it says, how come the rabbis don't stop the Jews from saying these inappropriate things? And some of the things they are saying is that he is not, again, not financially bountiful. And then we get 5 verse 64. Now, to say that God's hands are chained, even in the Jewish tradition, is very, very, very blasphemous, right? You can't say God's hands are chained. But the reason that the rabbis say it is not just to tell us that God's hands are chained, but also to tell us that when God redeems his own hands, he will also redeem the Jews. So let me say this a little more clearly. The Jewish tradition says that God's hands are chained just as the Jews' hands are chained in this poem. The Jewish tradition also says when God redeems his own hands, then the Jews will also be redeemed because God and the Jews are involved in this symbiotic relationship. The Quran comes in and says, that's ridiculous. If God really still loved you, he would not have put you through all of this torture. And we see that actually in another verse in the Quran, where in chapter 5, verse 18. So if we look at chapter 5, verse 18, just so I call it up. The Jews and Christians say, we are the sons of Allah and his loved ones. Say, why then does he chastise you for your sins? Right? The Quran says, if God really still loved you, he wouldn't punish you for your sins. He would forgive you. And you're walking around saying, not only is he in chains with us, but that he will redeem us when he is redeemed. And in fact, God destroys the temple out of love for the Jews. Okay, so what does that mean? That God destroys the temple out of love for the Jews? The idea, say the rabbis, is that the Jews' sin was so great that he really should have destroyed the Jews. But instead, he takes it out on the building. So he takes that out on the building and not on the people. The Quran comes in chapter 5, verse 18 and says, if he really loved you the way that you say, he wouldn't torture you at all. He would forgive you for your sins. And you're saying that God's hands are chained. Now, the other thing that's going on there in chapter 5, verse 64 is that the passage starts with the Jews making fun of Muslim prayer. Right? So if you look in chapter 5, I think it's around verse 60. Verse 58 says, when you call to prayer, they take it for jest and sport. Right? That the Quran is telling us that when the Muslims make their call to prayer, the Jews are making fun of them and making fun of Muslim prayer. And then 6 verses later, the Quran is making fun of a Jewish prayer, right? In the Jewish prayers, it says God's hand is chained. And the Quran is saying, no, God's hand is not chained. You're the ones that are the problem, not God. You're saying that God's hands are chained. You're not at all accurately understanding God. Your prayer is a problem. Our prayer is fine. So I think it's not that God is it's not that the Quran is misunderstanding anything that Judaism said. It's not that the Quran is thinking that the Jews are anthropomorphizing the verse. I think what we have here is a polemic in which the Quran is using the rabbis' words against them. Now, the final question we have to ask is, how did the Quran know about this prayer? Could this prayer, which was in the land of Israel, have gotten down to Arabia by this time so that the Quran was aware of it, right? Is Muhammad aware of it? How are the Muslims aware of this prayer so that this makes sense? That's a very big question. It's hard to know what, looking back 1400 years, it's hard to know what they knew. I will say that Islamic tradition says that the Hijra takes place in June or July of the year 622. And this holiday, the 9th of Av, is usually around July, August. So around the time that the Muslims are coming to Medina, the Jews are in this period of mourning in which this prayer would be recited. Now, I don't want to make too much of that because it's very hard to go back 1400 years and say when something happened and did the Muslims really come in June or July? Were the Jews really practicing this holiday? Right? It's very hard to know for sure. But I do think that it's tantalizing. And I do think that this idea that the Jews never said that is not true. That the Jews do have a prayer in which they said it. It's just that for the Jews, it was said as both a complaint against God and also a reassurance that God is on their side. And the Quran comes in and says, no, you're ridiculous. And it sort of makes fun of the Jews' claim.